Hello, my friends. Welcome to Summit Christmas Eve edition. Love Christmas Eve. Maybe you're meeting in groups, maybe you're not, but I gotta give a reflection on this particular week because I think Christmas Eve this year, I don't know, just feels important for 2020. You know what I mean? I gotta ask you a question. Do you believe that God can use all circumstances and situations for good? St. Paul says that in the letter to the Romans. He said, God makes all things work for good with those who love him. But do we believe it? Like the really broken, the messy, the even scandalous situations, the places that I've fallen short, and the areas where I'm flawed, or the places where I'm hurt or wounded, can God use that stuff? The gospel this week comes from Matthew, and there's a long version and a short version. A lot of people pick the short version because the long version is inclusive of a genealogy. Matthew wants to make sure that we understand that Jesus is situated firmly in the history of the nation Israel. So Matthew gives a genealogy from Abraham to David, from David to the Babylonian exile, from the Babylonian exile to Joseph. And it can get a little dry. It's a lot of Abraham was the father of Isaac, who was the father of Jacob, who was the father of Judah, and so on and so forth. And it can get a little dry. We don't know the names, we don't know the stories, we don't know the histories, but it's important. Because this shows that Jesus isn't just born into a manger, but Jesus is born into a really messy family line. Here's what I mean. Talk about a guy named Jacob. Jacob steals his birthright. So Jacob's second born. He's not supposed to be the firstborn. He shouldn't be in this genealogy. But he's shrewd. He tricks his father, Isaac, into giving him a blessing as firstborn by pretending to be his older brother. So already there's some deception here in the situation. We talk about Judah, and he has these twin sons, Perez and Zerah, but they're born to a woman named Tamar, and Tamar tricks Judah into getting her pregnant by pretending to be a prostitute. Tamar was married to several men, and they all died before she could have children. And so in a desire to have children, and out of some frustration with Judah and a promise he had made to her, she tricks him into giving her children. Deception, prostitution, this is scandalous. It continues when we talk about Rahab, whose name is included here. Rahab's important because she is a conspirator with the nation Israel in helping them win the promised land. She allows a couple of spies to stay in her inn, a couple of spies from Israel, so they can scout out the land that they're going to go in to take possession of, the land that God promised them. But Rahab's inn was probably a brothel. Rahab may have been a prostitute herself. Talk about Ruth, another key figure here. Ruth is a model of loyalty. There's an entire book in the Old Testament dedicated to her story. Ruth isn't even an Israelite. She's a Moabite. She marries into the nation Israel. And yet her name is included here as somebody outside. Matthew recognizes Ruth is so important she has to be included within this narrative, even though she falls outside of this nation Israel. We break it down and we get all the way to David, King David, a great king, but not a king without his flaws. And we find that out right away because the line is, David became the father of Solomon, whose mother had been the wife of Uriah. David has an affair with Uriah's wife, and she gets pregnant. And then David freaks out and sends Uriah knowingly to the front line of battle and orders the troops to pull back so Uriah will be killed. And David won't get caught up in a scandal. That's messy. Solomon, a great king, asks God for wisdom, but at the end of his life is not wise. He takes on wives from the other surrounding areas, from people outside of Israel, and they lead him away to false gods. And that's when the nation starts to fall apart. And this next line of kings that we read in Matthew's genealogy, if you go back to the book of Kings and the book of Chronicles, where they talk a little bit more about these people, oftentimes it says of these folks like Rehoboam, Ahaz, that they were evil. It says they did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. They followed in the ways of their fathers. They worshiped false gods. They didn't take down the shrines to false gods that existed in Israel. They didn't listen to God. And as a result of that infidelity, what happens? The Babylonian exile. The people lose the land that they had claimed, and they are now in exile in Babylon. And over time, people return, and things are quiet. Rome comes in and doesn't put them in slavery, but they're not necessarily free. And then Joseph is there in a messy situation. Joseph's a righteous man. He knows the law, And it's tough because Mary comes to him and says, I'm pregnant. And he trusts Mary and he loves Mary and he has no reason not to believe what she's saying. He knows she's a holy person. But think about it. If someone came to you and told you they had an encounter with an angel who told them they were going to bear the Savior of the world, that'd be tough. And Joseph, in the immensity of this moment, looking at his love for Mary, but also recognizing what the law demands and knowing that he can't bear false witness, because here's the situation. If Joseph says, it's my baby, well, then they know that both of them have violated their betrothal by being together before they were married. And it would be a lie, which is forbidden by the commandments. And Joseph would literally be bearing false witness because this is the kind of thing that could get taken to trial because it's potentially adulterous. So Joseph knows he can't violate the law in that way. He also knows what the law says about Mary, that as somebody who's committed adultery, she could potentially be stoned to death. And he doesn't want to do that. And at a minimum, he doesn't even want to expose Mary to shame because a part of his heart maybe is like, I don't know, this could be legit, but I just don't know. And in this moment, he decides the right thing for me to do is to divorce from Mary and make sure that she is not in a situation where, I'm exposing her to shame. And Joseph's still out of love wanting to protect her and also separate himself from this situation. It's messy. But God speaks to Joseph because God's working in the mess. And Joseph, rather than walking away, enters in. It's still a messy situation. You got to understand that Joseph doesn't have this dream and then suddenly everything's okay. There's still a lot to figure out. Like perhaps in Joseph's mind, there was still this nagging voice saying, do you really believe Mary? Do you really think are you going to raise somebody else's kid? Perhaps there was this thought of like, well, what if we still get found out and then Mary winds up getting hurt or stoned to death anyway, and I wind up in trouble. It's a messy situation. But Joseph has this faith that God can make all things work for good. And that if God is going to say to Joseph through this dream that Joseph discerns is valid, it's going to be okay. Don't be afraid to take Mary into your home. Joseph says, fine, Lord, you can work in the mess. I don't know how, I don't know what it's all going to look like, but I'm going to show up for every moment and work with you in that. The genealogy in Matthew is filled with people who sometimes worked with God's plan. People like Ruth, people like Rahab. But then it's filled with people who didn't. Like bad kings, Rehoboam and Ahaz. It's filled with people who were flawed and yet still could be great, like King David or even King Solomon. People like Jacob. And yet, we still wind up in this situation where God moved through these people. 2020 has been a mess. Do you believe that God can work in it? Maybe your life right now is a mess. Do you believe that God can do something good in it? Christmas is often a time where people in broken, messy families really feel the sting. There's hope here. Because maybe you're like, I can't go back to see my family. Or Christmases are always awful. My family's broken. So is the lineage of Jesus. Filled with scandalous, messy, sinful, broken people who tried their best, who did what they could, and some who just fell away. But God was working. And Joseph, in his dream, has God say, don't be afraid to enter into the mess, because I'm not. I think there's something really powerful there, isn't there? And God looks at you and says, don't be afraid to enter into this mess, because I'm already there. This Christmas, God is doing something. God is entering into the mess of our reality, the mess of this year, the mess of our challenges and our circumstances. And God is saying, I can bring good and am bringing good and will bring good out of all of this. Don't be afraid to come along with me. And that's where fidelity comes in. Joseph is faithful, but people in his family line were not always faithful. We have the choice this Christmas to look at the coming of the Christmas Christ, the Savior, and say, Lord, I will be faithful to you even in this mess, as you are faithful to me in the mess. There is a gift there. So if you're somebody who happens to be in charge of picking out which version of the reading you're going to do for the gospel this Christmas Eve, pick the long version. Tell them about the history of Israel. Tell them about the mess. Tell people about the scandal. Don't shy away from how just offensive parts of this can be. Because that's reality. And in that reality, in that mess, Jesus Christ is born, a Savior unto us to a world scarred and bruised and challenging and unknown and uncertain and full of fear and full of hatred and full of violence and full of sickness and confusion and death. And into your family, full of divorce, perhaps infidelity and lying and hurt feelings and bad pasts and unkind words and wounds and people who left and those who didn't show up and times that we just got it wrong and places we wish we could take back. Jesus shows up in all of that too. For every sad Christmas, for every bit of uncertainty, the Lord is there, waiting for you in the mess. Merry Christmas, my friends.